The first real cold snap of the season always came early in the Bitterroot Range. But that year, the cold didn't just arrive early, it came with teeth. It sank down from the Canadian border like a living thing, slithering through valleys, biting at the exposed, creeping into attics, gnawing at pipes. The locals in the tiny Montana town of Dalton Ridge said it felt like the winter of '89. The one old-timer swore had frozen cow horns solid and burst the water main under Main Street for 3 straight weeks. But out beyond the town limits, perched on a slope of lodgepole pine overlooking the iced-over stretch of Dalton Creek, lived a man whose name people said with equal parts admiration and confusion, Elias Boone. In a place where harsh men and harder winters weren't uncommon, Elias still stood out. People called him the Mountain Man, partly because he lived alone on land most folks wouldn't dare drive into during summer, let alone winter, and partly because, well, he looked like someone who'd stepped out from the wrong century. Beard halfway down his chest, shoulders like a barn door, eyes that had seen both beauty and brutality in this wilderness. Even his voice had that deep, patient cadence of someone who didn't rush anything, unless it was trying to kill him. He'd built his cabin by hand 14 years earlier. Not a kit, not a fast-build job, but a real, back-breaking, log-by-log frontier home. And for most of those 14 years, everyone in Dalton Ridge had agreed on one thing. Elias Boone had the warmest cabin in all of Montana. The strange thing, the thing that sparked almost a decade of arguments, jokes, bets, and rumors, was how he'd done it. It wasn't the wood stove, though he'd built that too, squatting over a bed of river stones as he welded scrap steel he'd bartered off a friend. It wasn't insulation, at least not insulation anyone recognized. And it sure wasn't electricity. His cabin sat 40 miles from the nearest power line. No, what kept that place warm enough to make a person sweat, even when the world outside froze solid, was something simpler, stranger, and in Elias' own words, just plain practical. It was his walls. More specifically, his double-layered, air-pocketed, self-venting thermal walls, a design the townsfolk labeled crazy the moment they heard about it. The structure used timber inside and out with a narrow gap between them, not filled with fiberglass or foam, but with what Elias called dead air. He'd learned the concept from an old book on frontier homesteading and modified it with something he discovered by accident while repairing a neighbor's barn. A vertical air channel system that pulled cold air down and warm air up, creating a sort of passive thermal buffer. Most people didn't understand it. Some refused to believe it worked. Others joked he probably had a grizzly in there breathing hot air. But none of them could deny it. During the coldest nights, while power flickered across town and half the county scrambled to keep pipes from bursting, Elias slept under only a thin wool blanket. Still, in a community where tradition often outweighed innovation, nobody ever asked him to build one for them. Maybe pride, maybe stubbornness. Maybe they just didn't like the idea of being outsmarted by a man who preferred elk tracks to pavement. That winter's cold snap hit harder than anyone expected. For 3 days straight, the temperature sank with no intention of rising again. By day 4, Dalton Ridge was in trouble. The power grid, strained by overloaded heaters, started its slow but steady collapse, section by section. At first, it was just flickers. By midnight, half the town was dark. In the grocery store, the emergency generator groaned like an old man in pain. At the fire station, volunteers boiled water on propane stoves just to keep pipes from freezing. Families wearing layers of blankets sat around kitchen tables lit by candles, listening to the wind scrape against the windows like a persistent intruder. Up in the mountains, Elias listened too, but with a different kind of calm. He sat beside his wood stove, boots off, socks steaming dry after a day of hauling in deadfall timber. His cabin hummed with warmth, the air almost too cozy to breathe. A pot of venison stew simmered beside him, filling the room with that rich, nostalgic smell that only a recipe learned from someone's grandfather could create. He didn't know the extent of the town's trouble, not yet, but he knew enough to guess this would be one of those winters the young ones would remember and the old ones would talk about for years. As he sipped his coffee, thick, black, and bitter from being reheated too many times, He stared at the wall he'd built so long ago. His hands traced the lines of the wood. He felt the faint draft pulling along the vent he'd created. "It's always the simplest things," he murmured. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, it barely mattered. The Traub reached Elias the next morning. He was working outside, chopping rounds from a fallen spruce, when he heard the crunch of tires over ice. Vehicles didn't come out this way often. The road was barely a suggestion of a road. But when they did, it was usually for one reason: someone needed help. He wiped sweat from his brow. Even though the air was so cold, the sweat instantly froze at the edges of his beard. A truck came into view, a Forest Green County pickup. The passenger door opened before the driver even finished stopping, and out stepped Sheriff Laura Kramer, a tough woman in her mid-40s with a streak of silver hair and the stubbornness of someone who'd grown up breaking horses and wrangling trouble. "Morning, Ilias," she called through the wind. "Got a minute?" "Always," he said, leaning the axe against the log. Laura trudged through the snow toward him, her breath fogging fast. She rubbed gloved hands together, trying to regain some feeling. Her cheeks were bright red from the cold. "Hell of a winter," she said. "Yep. Town S in a bind. Power grid failed. Heating systems are dropping one after another. We've got folks with kids, folks with medical needs, folks who can't get warm no matter what they try." Elias waited. He knew that tone. It meant the sheriff wasn't done yet. "You built this place different," she continued, gesturing to his cabin. "Everybody knows it. We need to move people somewhere warm. The community center's generator failed last night. The station's running out of propane. If the temperature keeps dropping—" She didn't finish the sentence. "She didn't need to." "You want to bring people here," Elias said quietly. "Not everyone, just a dozen at most. Maybe just families, just enough to get them through the worst of it." Elias' jaw tense. He'd lived alone for almost 15 years. Solitude wasn't just a preference, it was a way of life. The thought of strangers in his space, in the one place he'd built with his own 2 hands to be his private refuge, it twisted something inside him. But then he looked past her, down the trail toward the distant view of Dalton Ridge, where smoke curled desperately from chimneys and the cold glittered like a predator. "How bad is it?" he asked. Elias, her voice softened. "People are freezing in their homes." He exhaled a long breath, turning toward the cabin. Inside, it glowed with warmth, 32 degrees warmer than the outdoors by his last measure, maybe more today. He thought of kids with pale fingers and families sitting around silent generators. He imagined the way cold seeped into bones, grinding down hope with every hour. "All right," he said finally, "bring them." Sheriff Kramer's shoulders dropped, relief flooding her face. "You're doing a good thing," she said. "Don't thank me yet." When the convoy arrived 2 hours later, 2 pickups, 1 SUV, and a snowmobile carrying supplies, Elias stood outside with a coil of rope slung across one shoulder, ready to clear snow, haul gear, or do whatever was needed. The families stepped out into the brittle cold. A mother holding a toddler wrapped like a burrito, an older couple leaning on each other for balance, a teenage boy rubbing his arms furiously, 2 little girls stumbling as they tried to keep their boots from slipping. Their faces had that hollow, exhausted look Elias knew too well from years of winter disasters. That look of people who tried everything and still came up short. One of the little girls, maybe 8 years old, wearing a pink knit hat too thin for real cold, stopped in front of him. "Mister," she said, looking up with big brown eyes, "is your house really warm?" Elias knelt so he was eye level with her. "Warmer than July," he said. Her lips curled into a tiny smile. They entered the cabin and the warmth hit them instantly, a soft, gentle wave of relief that washed across every face. Women sighed. Men closed their eyes. Kids unfroze, literally and emotionally. "It's like a different country in here," one of the fathers murmured. "What kind of heating system do you have?" asked the older man, peering around. "Same as everyone else," Elias replied. "Just burns less wood." The teenage boy touched the inner wall. Feels weird, he said. Warm but not hot, how does that work? Elias hesitated, uncomfortable with attention. Just a little idea, he said. Air does the work, not the fire. Sheriff Kramer looked at him, a knowing smile forming. And as evening settled and snow began to fall again, harder now, angrier, something happened that Elias hadn't expected. A feeling he thought he'd buried years ago crept into his cabin. The feeling of a home being shared. The sound of laughter echoing softly. The warmth of human presence, not just the wood stove. He watched as the families gathered blankets, shared stories, made space for each other. He watched a toddler curl up near the stove, a mother finally relax her shoulders, and two children whisper secrets in the corner. And for the first time in a long time, Elias Boone felt something crack open inside him. Something he'd closed off the day he lost his own family. A day he never spoke about. A day he'd sworn the cold would never touch again. As the wind screamed through the night and the snow piled high against the windows, Elias stood by the door, staring out into the endless white, knowing something was coming. Something colder, something harsher, something that would test not just his walls, but his heart. And deep in that freezing wilderness, a question hung in the air, waiting to be answered. Elias woke before everyone else, as he always did. Years of mountain living had carved the habit into him. Wake early, move early, work early, because daylight in winter wasn't a promise, only a loan. But when he opened the cabin door to check the weather, even he felt a knot of unease tighten in his gut. The snow wasn't just deep. It was wrong. It came up to his waist in some places, sculpted by the wind into sharp ridges like the spine of some ancient beast lying beneath the surface. The air tasted metallic, the way it did when temperatures dipped so low they made your teeth ache. He stood there for a moment, the cold biting at his skin before shutting the door. Inside, warmth clung to the walls like a living thing. The families still slept, cocooned in borrowed quilts and blankets. Tiny snores drifted from the far corner where the two little girls slept beneath Elias' old buffalo hide. A kettle hissed softly on the stove from where he'd left water warming overnight. He stepped quietly across the wooden floor, careful not to wake anyone, and poured himself a mug of coffee. It steamed in the warm air, filling the cabin with that rugged, grounding smell of roasted beans and wood smoke. As he sipped, he looked around at the people filling his home, filling the spaces he'd deliberately left empty for more than a decade. A mother tucked her toddler against her chest, even in sleep. An older man breathed shallowly, wrapped in a blanket that had belonged to Elias' wife. A teenage boy rested on the bench beneath the window, one arm hanging off the side, his breath fogging lightly in the cold draft sneaking past the doorframe. Elias had built this cabin for one. Now there were 12 people inside. And strangely, the place felt more alive than it ever had. He wasn't sure if that feeling scared him or comforted him. Around 7, the sheriff stirred. She blinked awake like someone surfacing from a deep lake. "Morning," she croaked, stretching her back until it popped. "Coffee on the table," Elias said. She stood, rubbed her eyes, and took a mug gratefully. After one sip, she leaned against the counter and exhaled long and slow. "God, that's good. You ever known me to make bad coffee?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Remember that mess you made for the volunteer fire meeting? Half the guys swore you brewed it with diesel." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. It was small, but it was the most genuine smile he'd felt in months. She set the mug down and lowered her voice. "Town's worse than I thought. Radio says temperature dropped to -34 overnight. Some houses hit below freezing inside. We've got frozen pipes all across Maple Street. Hank Denton's roof collapsed under the weight of the snow." Elias' jaw tightened. Laura continued, "We need to send someone back down soon, check if more families need to be brought up." He glanced at the sleeping families. "How are they holding up?" "Well," she said, softening, "they're alive and warm. That's more than I can say for some folks down the ridge." Elias walked to the window, his boots creaking over the old boards. He stared at the white wasteland outside. "Road-s gone," he said. "It'll take hours to dig through even with the snowmobile." "We don't have hours," Laura replied. A shadow passed over his face, not fear exactly, but something deeper. A memory, a reminder, something from a winter long ago when help had come too late. He set his coffee down. "I'll go." She straightened. "You sure?" He nodded once. Someone's gotta check on the people who can't check on themselves. By 9, the families were awake, the cabin buzzing with soft chatter, clinking dishes, and the quiet hum of hope returning to tired bodies. Elias fed the stove, chopped extra firewood in the lean-to, and filled the inside rack until it overflowed. Before he left, one of the little girls, the one with the pink hat, tugged on his sleeve. "Mr. Elias." "Him." She held out a hand. In her palm was a tiny plastic charm shaped like a snowflake. "It's lucky," she whispered. "I want you to have it so you don't freeze." He stared at it for a long moment. Then, carefully, almost reverently, he closed her fingers around it again. "You keep it," he said softly. "I'll be home soon, but I'll need someone watching over the cabin while I'm gone." Her smile could have thawed the whole valley. Elias stepped outside into the world of ice. The cold slapped him instantly, turning every breath into a sharp sting. Frost clung to his beard within minutes. He pulled his fur-lined hood tight and secured the scarf under his chin. Sheriff Kramer handed him the snowmobile keys. "You sure you can handle this alone?" "I've seen worse," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "No, you haven't. This storm's setting records." "I've still seen worse." She stared at him long enough to catch the meaning behind his words, the kind of worse that had nothing to do with the weather. Then she clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Be careful." The snowmobile roared to life, though the engine struggled against the cold. Elias guided it down the narrow trail, leaning into the wind as it blasted him with snow so fine it felt like sand. Every 100 yards, the machine snarled through drifts chest-high. Every few minutes he had to stop, unclog the intake, or clear a path. The cold gnawed at his fingers through his gloves. His face burned with frost. His breath felt thin and metallic, like he was inhaling through a frozen straw. But he kept going, because halfway down the mountain, an unease took root inside him, an instinct he'd learned long before he ever built that cabin. Something was wrong. Something more than a bad storm. He didn't know what yet, but the mountain had a way of whispering to those who listened. And Elias always listened. The first house he reached belonged to Hank Denton. Or rather, had belonged. The roof had indeed collapsed. Snow poured into the living room like a white waterfall. Elias killed the snowmobile, trudged to the front door, and pushed it open. Inside, the cold was absolute. "Hank," he shouted. No answer. He moved deeper into the home, boots crunching over ice. "Hank." At the far end of the room, near the doorway to the kitchen, something stirred. Hank Denton, wrapped in 2 blankets and shivering violently, pushed himself up from the floor. "Elias," his voice cracked. "Holy hell, I thought I was done for." It took nearly 20 minutes to get him bundled up, warmed with a thermos of hot water, and secured on the snowmobile's rear tow sled. "You picked a good time to check on me," Hank muttered. "Another hour or 2 and they'd have found me frozen stiff." "Can you hold on?" Elias asked. "Son, if I let go, I'll haunt you." It might have been funny if both men weren't painfully aware of how close it had been. The next home belonged to the Millers, a family of 5. They weren't home. Elias' gut twisted. Tracks in the snow led toward town. He prayed they made it. He prayed they didn't get caught on the road. The drifts there were taller than pickup trucks. He pushed onward. 2 more houses empty. One rancher half-conscious from hypothermia. An elderly woman found by her back door, collapsed under the weight of a busted pipe she'd tried to fix herself. Each rescue added weight to the sled behind him. Each stop stole precious daylight. Each breath felt colder. By mid-afternoon, the sky had gone a dangerous shade of gray-blue, the color of steel just before it snaps. The wind howled harder. Trees cracked in the distance. Elias knew what that meant. The storm wasn't easing. It was building. By the time he turned back up the mountain, pulling 3 people behind him, the temperature had dropped another 5 degrees. His eyelashes froze into tiny needles. His hands felt clumsy, slow. The snowmobile fought him every inch of the climb. Halfway up, the engine sputtered. He snarled, slammed the choke forward, and coaxed it back to life, but only barely. He could feel it fading. He could smell cold oil. He could hear the pitch of the motor changing with every foot of elevation gained. And he was still miles from the cabin. Still miles from warmth. Still miles from the families whom he had promised he'd return to. The wind screamed around him. The mountain groaned. The storm grew teeth. And for the first time in years, Elias Boone felt a flicker of fear prick the back of his neck. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of failing. Because if he didn't make it back, if the engine failed, if he got stuck out here in the blinding cold, 12 people in his cabin would be waiting for a man who wasn't coming home. He gritted his teeth. Not again. Not this time. Not this winter. He leaned forward, whispering through frozen lips. Come on, just a little farther. The snowmobile coughed, lurched, and then a sound like breaking metal. The engine sputtered one last time, then died. The cold swallowed the silence. Elias sat still for a moment, feeling the sting of the wind bite deeper than before. Behind him, Hank Denton called his name, voice trembling with fear. But Elias didn't panic. No. He looked up the mountain, toward his cabin, toward warmth, toward tea. He families depending on him, and he made a decision. A hard one. A dangerous one. The kind only a mountain man would consider rational. He wrapped a rope around his waist, hooked the other end to the tow sled, carrying 3 shivering souls. Then, step by punishing step, Elias Boone began pulling them up the mountain on foot. Through waist-deep snow, through wind that sliced like knives, through a storm that wanted him dead. Because some promises are worth pulling your whole world behind you. The snow swallowed his boot completely, dragging at his leg like a living hand. The rope around his waist bit into him with the weight of 3 people clinging to life behind him. The wind roared so loud it drowned out his own breath. And the cold, the cold, pressed against him with the grinding pressure of something relentless, ancient, and hungry. But Elias Boone kept moving. Left foot. Right foot. Lean, pull, breathe. Repeat. He wasn't a young man anymore. Years of solitude had made him strong, but age had put a quiet stiffness into his knees, a heaviness into his bones. Still, the mountain had taught him that strength wasn't in muscle alone. Strength was a promise. Strength was a memory. Strength was refusing to stop when stopping meant someone else wouldn't see tomorrow. Behind him, Hank Denton shivered violently in the tow sled. You okay back there? Elias shouted over the wind. I'll be damned if I die before paying off my truck, Hank rasped. It was the closest thing to a joke either of them could manage. The mountain loomed above them, each ridge like the edge of a blade pressed against the sky. The trail had vanished entirely under the storm. Elias navigated by instinct, by the shape of the trees, by the tilt of the ground, by an internal compass carved through years of surviving what no one sane would attempt. But with the storm raging, even that instinct faltered. At one point, he drifted too far west. The slope steepened without warning. His boots slipped on hidden ice. He lurched forward, the rope yanking painfully at his waist as the sled behind him jerked. Whoa, Hank shouted. Don't kill us before the cold does. Elias caught himself against a tree trunk, clinging until his heartbeat slowed. Breathing hard, he looked around. The world was a blur of white and wind. He adjusted, shifted course, and pulled again. An hour passed, maybe more. The storm made time meaningless. Elias' legs burned. His fingers felt thick and clumsy, even inside insulated gloves. His breath came shallow, then ragged. Sweat froze against his skin. Every few minutes he had to stop, lean forward with his hands braced on his knees, and force air back into his lungs. Each time he stopped, Hank's voice cut through the storm. "You still with us, Boone?" And each time, Elias answered the same. "Not leaving you." But the truth clawing inside his ribs was darker. He could feel his strength slipping, his pace slowing, the cold creeping deeper. He needed to reach the ridge soon. The last half-mile to the cabin always cut through a pocket of dense trees that blocked most of the wind. If he could get there, he had a chance. If he did. He didn't allow himself to finish the thought. As he climbed a switchback buried under snow, a distant sound cracked through the air. A snapping tree. No, not just a snap, a crack like a rifle shot. Elias froze. The mountain went quiet for one suspended heartbeat. Then came the roar. A low, rumbling, thunderous roar. His eyes widened. "Avalanche," he whispered. And the mountain answered. A white wall tore loose from the ridge above, a tidal wave of ice and snow, rolling and tumbling with devastating force. Hank saw it too. Elias run. But Elias didn't run. He ripped the knife from his belt, cut the rope, and spun toward the sled. Get off now." "I can't feel my legs," Hank cried. Elias didn't argue. He grabbed Hank under the arms, hauled him out of the sled like a bag of grain, and shoved him toward a cluster of pines off the trail. "Move, damn it." Hank stumbled forward, collapsing behind the trees, curling into the snow like a wounded animal. The avalanche roared closer. Elias ran to the sled, overturned it, and wedged it against the pine trunks as a crude shield. He threw himself behind it just as the world exploded. The wave hit the trees with a sound like collapsing mountainsides. Snow slammed into the sled, the impact shaking his teeth. Branches snapped. Wind blasted down the slope, carrying shards of ice sharp as needles. Elias pressed into the earth, head down, praying the pines would hold. Seconds stretched. Minutes. There was no time anymore, only the crushing weight of nature's fury. Then slowly, the roar faded. The wind softened. The mountain exhaled. Elias lifted his head, coughing. The world around him was unrecognizable. Snow piled in mounds taller than he was, trees bent or broken, the sled half buried. But he was alive. "Hank," he croaked. No answer. Panic stabbed his chest. He crawled through the drift, shouting louder. "Hank." A faint groan answered. Elias found him half buried under snow, face pale but eyes open. "You still with me?" Elias asked, voice shaking. "Barely," Hank whispered. "Damn snow tried to kill me twice." Elias couldn't help the breathless laugh that escaped him. But his relief lasted only a moment. He looked up the mountain. The avalanche had buried the trail completely. What had been a manageable climb was now a slope of shifting snow and broken timber, treacherous, unstable, unpredictable. There was no path back, not one a sane man would take. But the storm was getting worse. The temperature was dropping again, and the people in his cabin were waiting. He searched the ridge, calculating risk like a man who'd spent his entire life gambling with nature. There, a narrow break between the drifts, a steep-cut bank that looked climbable, not safe, not easy, but possible. He turned back to Hank. "I'm getting you out of here." Hank shook his head weakly. "Elias, you can't carry me up that hill." Elias knelt, his breath misting between them. "When I was 33, he said quietly, "my wife got caught in a winter slide up near Broken Horn Ridge." Hank's eyes softened. He knew the story, everyone did. I couldn't get to her in time, Elias whispered. I didn't have the strength, or the right tools, or the sense to keep her close. He swallowed hard. I don't make the same mistake twice. Hank's throat tightened. Elias, you don't owe me. Elias shot him a look sharp enough to cut ice. I owe my wife, he growled. And I pay that debt by making damn sure no one dies on my mountain again. With that, he hauled Hank onto his back in a fireman's carry, gripping the man's wrist over his shoulder. Hold on, Elias ordered. I'm trying. Then step by brutal step, Elias Boone climbed. The ascent was a nightmare. His boots punched through unstable snow with every step, making him sink to his thighs. His muscles burned so hot they felt like they were tearing. His breath grew wild, desperate. Several times he slipped, once sliding several feet before catching a tree root with his free hand. The jolt nearly tore his shoulder out of its socket, and Hank screamed behind him. Put me down, Hank begged. You'll kill yourself. Shut up, Elias gasped. Another step. Another. The world narrowed to pain, to weight, to cold, to survival. He could hear his heartbeat pounding in his ears, drowning out the storm, drowning out everything. At last, after what felt like climbing the length of the whole damn mountain, he reached the ridge, collapsing to his knees. Hank rolled off his back into the snow. They lay there side by side, faces turned to the sky. You alive? Elias panted. I think so, Hank whispered. If I'm not, this is a weird heaven. Elias laughed weakly. It felt like someone had driven a stake through his ribs. Every breath hurt. His hands trembled violently. His legs felt carved from lead. But he wasn't done. He forced himself up. The trees thinned ahead, the sign he was close to the final stretch, close to the cabin. Beyond the thinning pines, through sheets of blowing snow, a faint glow flickered in the distance. Warm light. Lantern light. Cabin light. Home. He lifted Hank again and staggered forward. Behind him, the storm surged. Ahead, the cabin lights grew brighter. At last, finally, Elias Boone reached the clearing. Through the blizzard, he saw the cabin door burst open. Sheriff Kramer stood there, lantern held high. Her face flooded with shock. Elias. He stumbled the last few steps, snow up to his shins, lungs searing, vision tunneling. He pushed Hank into her arms. Get him inside, Elias rasped. Elias, come on, you two. But he didn't hear the rest. His knees buckled. His vision dimmed. The cold finally claimed its due. And as he collapsed into the snow, the last thing he heard was someone shouting his name. Elias. Then everything went dark.